This is the first video in the Dispelling Parliamentary Myths series. In this video, we're going to cover a very important question, and that is, does the candidate with the most votes always win the election? It is a very commonly held belief that if you receive more votes than anyone else, you are elected to the position. But as we go through this video, we will see that this isn't always the case. To understand why, we need to review the difference between a plurality vote and a majority vote. A plurality vote essentially means that a choice receives more votes than any other choice, while the term majority vote means more than half of the votes cast. These two definitions can seem quite similar at first, but in actuality, they are considerably different. Robert's Rules of Order has this to say about a majority vote. The word majority means more than half, and when the term majority vote is used without qualification, as in the case of the basic requirement, it means more than half of the votes cast by persons entitled to vote, excluding blanks or abstentions, at a regular or properly called meeting. Robert's Rules of Order also provides that in recording the votes cast, the principle followed is that a choice has no mandate from the voting body unless approval is expressed by more than half of those entitled to vote in registering any evidence of having some preference. So keep that in mind. A choice has no mandate unless approved by more than half of the votes cast, and majority vote means more than half of the votes cast. In regards to a plurality vote, Robert's Rules of Order provides the following. A plurality vote is the largest number of votes to be given any candidate or proposition when three or more choices are possible. The candidate or proposition receiving the largest number of votes has a plurality. Robert's Rules of Order goes on to say, a plurality that is not a majority never chooses a proposition or elects anyone to office except by virtue of a special rule previously adopted. Robert's Rules of Order goes on to clarify that if such a rule is to apply to the election of officers, it must be prescribed in the bylaws. So, if no such rule is in the bylaws, and I don't recommend placing one there since it runs contrary to a basic principle of parliamentary law, a majority vote is required to elect an individual to an office. Let's take a look at an example of how this works. Let's say we have three candidates nominated for office. And let's say candidate number 1 receives 45 votes. Candidate number 2 receives 38 votes. And candidate number 3 receives 17 votes. Who wins the election? Well, candidate number 1 has the most votes with 45, so does he win the election? Well, we don't know yet. First, we have to add up all the votes cast. When we do that, we get a total of 100 votes. We then have to determine a majority of that number. Remember that majority means more than half. Half of 100 is 50, so anything over 50 is a majority. Since we're dealing with whole numbers and not fractions, 51 is the lowest number that represents a majority in this case. So 51 is the necessary to elect number. That's our magic number that a candidate must reach in order to be elected. Did candidate number 1 reach that number? No. So is candidate number 1 elected? No. This is what is called a no election. So what happens from here? Well, when you have a no election, you have to vote again, and again, and again if necessary, until one candidate receives a majority of the votes cast. Robert's Rules of Order states, if any office remains unfilled after the first ballot, the balloting is repeated for that office as many times as necessary to obtain a majority vote for a single candidate. It goes on to say, when repeated balloting for an office is necessary, individuals are never removed from candidacy on the next ballot unless they voluntarily withdraw, which they are not obligated to do. So all of the candidates remain eligible, and the vote is taken again. Many people assume that the lowest vote getter is dropped from the ballot, or that only the top 2 candidates remain on the ballot. Under Robert's Rules of Order and common parliamentary law, this is not the case. So let's look at an example of how the reballoting might turn out. This time, let's say candidate number 1 received 58 votes. Candidate number 2 received 46 votes, and candidate number 3 received 11 votes. Did candidate number 1 win this time? Don't be too quick to answer because we don't know yet. We can't use the magic number from last time. We have to count all the votes again. And when we add all these up, we now get 115, and that gives us a new necessary to elect number of 58. So, did candidate number 1 win the election this time? Yes, he actually did, but by the narrowest margin possible, because the necessary to elect number is 58, and he received 58. If we add up all the other votes, we get 57, and we see something very interesting. To win by a majority vote, you not only have to receive the most votes, but you also have to receive more votes than everyone else combined. And that's how we know that the Assembly's true choice has been elected. Now, whenever I discuss reballoting, someone always expresses a fear that the vote totals won't change, that everyone will continue to cast their votes for the same individuals. Well, things can and do change when reballoting. In our example, the total number of votes increased. This can happen because on the first ballot, some members may not vote. It could be that they simply didn't care about that particular office, or maybe they don't actually like the incumbent, but they assumed no other candidate had a chance, so they didn't bother voting. But when they see the results on the first ballot, suddenly they're interested. Also, keep in mind that even if everyone voted on the first ballot and we get the exact same number of vote totals on the next ballot, the total votes for each candidate are generally not going to be the same on subsequent ballots. Some members may have voted for a friend, for example, but now that they see their friend only received 6 votes out of 100, they may choose to use their vote on the subsequent ballot for someone who has a better shot of actually winning. So yes, vote totals do change on subsequent ballots. As a professional parliamentarian, I've seen this happen, and I actually had one client organization that assumed there was a winner for the office of treasurer. But when I checked the totals, I informed them that they would have to vote again since the leading vote getter did not actually obtain a majority vote. On the second ballot, a majority vote was reached, but it was not the candidate who was leading on the first ballot. The second place candidate from the first ballot received enough votes on the second ballot to actually win the election. This is a great example of the rules of parliamentary law performing their function, because the majority of voters did not choose the leading vote getter on the first ballot. If he had been declared elected, that would not be a true reflection of the will of the majority of the voters. That covers the question, does the candidate with the most votes always win the election?